We are live here, so thank you very much for joining us. My name is Dan Dakin, and I'll be your host for this 2022 COVI lecture series, which is the 15th year of the COVI lecture series, which is really incredible. So I'm really excited today that we've got Brock University professor Don Sear as our speaker. Today's lecture will run for about 30 to 35, 40 minutes, somewhere in there. And then we'll have a question and answer period after that. So please just type your questions into the chat box as the presentation is taking place. And then I'll ask those questions to Professor Sear after his presentation has wrapped up. So again, thank you very much for joining us. And Professor Sear, very, very happy to have you here joining us. I'll give you a quick bio. So Don Sear is a professor of finance in the Goodman School of Business and chair of the University Senate. Professor Sear has a BSc in geology from Concordia University, an MBA from the University of Saskatchewan, and an MA in economics and PhD in finance from University of Alberta. He serves on the executive committee and advisory council of COVI and on the editorial advisory board of the Journal of Wine Economics. And today, Professor Sear is going to share his knowledge and the latest research here in a lecture titled Potential Use of Weather Derivatives in Hedging Aggregate Viticulture Yields, a case study of the Niagara region of Canada. So with that, I'll ask Professor Sear to please share your screen, and looking forward to hearing this.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I'll pull up my screen here. Let's get back to okay, I think I'm up. Am I sharing, Dan, yet? Or?
Yes, you are good to go. Your screen is up.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, for the nice and complimentary introduction. As Dan indicated, the title of the talk is Potential Use of Weather Derivatives in Hedging Aggregate Viticulture Yields, a case study of the Niagara region of Canada. My co-author, Joseph Kushner, is a professor of economics here at Brock University, and this started as part of an OEVI undergraduate honors thesis with student Mingtian Zhang, who has now graduated. We're going around to taking the work now and getting it ready for publication. In fact, it's already been set out for review with the Journal of Wine Economics. So I'll get started here. So what I'm talking about is something called weather derivatives, different names for it. Weather derivatives, weather contracts, parametric insurance, index insurance are terms that are also used to describe essentially the same thing. And so they're financial contracts with a payout that is specified amount based on the occurrence of a weather-related variable. So, you know, temperature, rainfall, snowfall, measured at some independent, typically government weather station, measuring station. They usually take the form of similar to what would be a call or a put option on common stock. The payout is triggered by an agreed upon strike value, and payout is a set amount per unit of measurement above if it was a call option, or below if it was the strike value. So for example, producer buys from some seller a call option on cumulative rainfall over the months of September and October that pays, let's say, $2,000 for every minimum of rain above 150 millimeters. So that's paid by the seller of the contract to the buyer of the contract. It's like, it's kind of similar to insurance. We'll talk about the difference between them. In this case, the strike is 150 millimeters. So when it hits 150 millimeters of rain over the cumulative over September and October, then anything above that, every millimeter will be worth $2,000, will be paid out by the seller of the option, in this case a call option, to the buyer. And then there's a price for this contract called the premium. Sometimes we'll talk about contract price premium, and that's what the buyer pays the seller for the contract. So this is the idea, and they can get more complex than that. I can put a cap on how much I'm going to get paid. That'll lower the value of the contract price that I, as a buyer, pay the contract seller. And there's all kinds of fancy structures that we can get into, but we'll keep it a fairly simple type of contract. Now, these things are lower in price than traditional insurance, and that's due to a couple of different factors. One is that with insurance, I have to have proof of damage. There's an adjuster process. The insurance company sends an adjuster to ensure that I had a significant loss of some sort, and they estimate the value of that. They pay out with insurance. There's other complexities with insurance, of course. The insurer faces adverse selection. An agricultural producer who recognizes that their expected indemnities exceed their premiums, they're more likely to purchase coverage than those whose premiums are actuarially high. So, you know, the insurance company all builds this into the price of insurance. The adjustment process, to send an adjuster out there, they have this issue to deal with. And there's also moral hazard. The insured may affect the level of loss. The insurer, let's say, realizing that they have a loss, might not undertake actions to mitigate the loss. So that all gets built into the price of insurance. Weather derivatives, however, don't involve any of that. In a sense, it's a bet on weather that is going to pay out if this weather index, say cumulative rainfall, reaches a certain point and above or under. You know, we can structure these whatever way we want. And they're well suited as, and I put in quotations here, insurance for systemic risk, in the sense that, let's say, not an actual peril, weather peril such as hail, which we typically buy insurance for, but rather just lower yield or quality or price, let's say, or due to some weather variable that's going to affect those. And so that's what they're good for. Agricor has forage rainfall coverage, not used much in terms of the wine industry, but in terms of the hay, growing hay, it's used, and it's a weather derivative type of contract. So that's an example if you want to take a look. Bit of history here. I've just put a lot of this down. They started in 1996 in Enron. The infamous Enron had entered into a weather-based, a temperature-based weather contract with an energy company. There was a lot of interest in them. In 1999, Chicago Mercantile Exchange started standardized weather contracts, which still exist on major U.S. cities, based on cold degree days and heating degree days. And these are used in the energy industry. The London International Financial Futures Exchange, they introduced some, but then the lack of demand, that dropped off. It was a very innovative company, Weatherbill, that started out, and they were offering all kinds of weather contracts. 2007, they later sold out, became the Climate Corporation, went to Monsanto, subsequently changed direction, in a sense, away from weather derivatives. There are snowfall contracts that trade on Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and they're used by large cities. Rainfall contracts, also on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. These are weather derivatives. 2008, the financial crisis, after that point in time, just about anything that had the word derivative in it, financial derivative, was not very popular after the issues with collateralized mortgage obligations. And so sort of demand died off. There is a Weather Risk Management Association that is heavily involved in the in companies that are involved in this weather industry. Slow growth until it's been picking up. Now, aside from contracts that trade on, let's say, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, there's an over-the-counter market. So non-standardized contracts specific to some buyer or user that would be sold by insurance or specialized financial service companies to buyers. So they're not traded on the exchange. They're private contract, typically between somebody that's in the insurance industry or something similar and a user. It's growing slowly, this market, for a variety of reasons. The usage has been more apparent still in energy, construction industry, event and marketing applications. Golf tournaments have used them, ski hills, where they buy a contract that will pay out if there's low snowfall. Tourism, even the company in the US that sells these contracts for weddings, going to have an outdoor wedding, it's going to rain. The contract will pay out a certain amount of rainfall. So they seem to have been a great idea that's just never really taken off. And in particular, it's not been of great use in agriculture. Probably one of the lowest usages. And that's been somewhat perplexing, given that, weather, of course, has significant impact for agricultural producers. Just a couple of references there that speak to this issue. So, and in terms of the viticulture industry, there's been a lot of proposed applications, of which myself and some other co-authors have designed and shown how they could be used. So these are just some references. This is an area of research that I'd moved away from, but I'm getting back into. And you can see that we were doing a lot of work back in 2008, 2009 with weather derivatives, but there's been some newer ones that have come along here. Weather derivative design in wine production for Mediterranean grapes, weather index-based insurance as a meteorological risk management alternative in viticulture. So with with climate change increasing volatility of weather, you're seeing perhaps a little bit more of an interest in uptake. In terms of developing countries, there's been quite a number of applications. These, this you'd have to say, have been largely focused around subsistence agricultural producers, developing countries. It's what's called microinsurance. And since 2000, there's been approximately 150 weather index insurance pilots across 50 different countries. They're oftentimes supported by the World Bank, for example, other within the country, a government-run insurance company, and they're backed in the reinsurance industry by some large other insurance companies. So, been a lot of attempts at use of that because, again, it appears that there would be a great value, but not a lot of them have, again, been sustainable programs. We'll talk about a little bit the issue there as to why that's going on. Why is that not happening? So what seems to be the problem? Well, and particularly within the context of developed countries, why aren't we seeing this used more in agriculture? Well, so here's a list of things when you take a look at the insurance industry and what they tend to say about it. Well, individual users, producers want specialized contracts with terms specific to their situation. So if I've got the Vineland weather measuring station, and then I'm a grape grower in the Niagara region, how far away from there am I? How close is that weather to my situation measured at the Vineland weather station? These are things that are called basis risk. How well is this contract going to relate to my particular situation. So I want specialized. I want a specialized contract. I want a certain strike, and I want a certain tick size. That's how much it pays out with every unit of measurement that takes place. And I've got to know that myself. I have to know what works for me. So there's a lack of awareness and ability of supplier to help with appropriate contract terms for producers, for individual producers in particular, small, so there's an insurance company going out, to all different producers. They might be dissatisfied with the results. How well did it compensate for the weather-related variable? And insurance companies worry about that as being a reputational issue for themselves, which might spill out to other products that they sell. Pricing. Certainly there's been a lot of studies that have looked at the pricing of weather derivatives and something called willingness to pay. Are you willing to pay a certain price for these weather contracts? Most of these studies, though, have been carried out in these developing countries where there's been quite a lot of different programs that have been rolled out. And generally, it would appear that there requires some government subsidization. There's cost of, a proof of damage is required. So even though the insurance company, even though it's not insurance per se, where insurance you have to have a proof of possible risk of loss, they have to undergo the same type of paperwork, because otherwise it's just a gambling contract between the insurance company and the producer. So they have to get into all of that as well. They have to have additional clauses required in case of failure of the weather measuring device. If something goes down, what's going to happen? How are we going to determine what the payout is? So you're talking about, from the insurance industry side, small contracts, specialized aspects to them, a lot of work, and there's not a lot of room to have a lot of great markup on them. So that seems to be, from the supplier side, the issue. It's a thin market in that sense, and it requires a risk aggregator, which has been suggested, maybe an industry, maybe a cooperative, government and group to undertake activity in program development. That's what we're going to be attempting a little simulation on, to see how that might work. On the demand side, the viticulture producer who might be looking to buying these, there's what's called basis risk. Yes, the weather station that we're using, how far is it away from me? How well does it correlate with the actual weather of my vineyard? Rainfall, for example, is notorious for this. It can be raining at the weather station, not at the vineyard. Lack of awareness. There's a lot of agricultural producers not that familiar with it. Now, when it comes to these studies about willingness to pay, which I have the caveat there that many of these are focused on, let's say, developing countries, and they look at, wealth has been an issue of whether someone is willing to pay for one of these contracts. But it's very hard to take those results and put it to a producer in a developed country. Pricing is an issue, and again, the thinness of the market comes up. So that's what we're focusing on here. So we're going to look at the grape growers of Ontario. Of course, established in 1947, 480 grape growers, 17,000 acres of vineyard. 80% are located in the Niagara region. Most of the grape production for wine, small amount for jams, etc. 37% hybrid, an average 62% vinifera. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, well, what would happen if the grape growers of Ontario said, we will buy a weather-based contract that will pay out, and we'll handle the cost and the distribution among our members. So in this way, it aggregates the producers, and it also, it makes for a bigger size contract, which then an insurance company or a supplier is willing to sit down and say, okay, this makes some sense. We could get into that. We're not into all these small different contracts. So here's, for example, this is from the Great Rivers of Ontario. This is tonnage from 2003 to 2018. And here's hybrid and also vinifera yields. And you can see they're increasing over time. A lot of that increase is not due so much to increase acreage, but increase ability to produce, and also the age of the vines drives that upward trend. Now, in our simulation, we're going to detrend that data. We're going to pretend and say, well, let's take that out. We want to see how weather itself is affecting this tonnage. And so we will flatten that curve. We will standardize across time and say, okay, let's just look at how weather affects this. Now, we took a look. We decided, let's look at several different indices. The Winkler and Euclid indices are commonly used to look at the growing season, suitability of the growing season, two slightly different indices, but they measure much the same thing. We're looking at that from 2018. You can see here that there's not a trend in there. It's there's volatility, but it's not increasing. We also looked at an index that would measure a rough measure of potential winter injury, or measure of cold winters between, you can see here, November 1st to March 31st. And what this is it says how, in any given day, how many degrees below, let's say, -5 was it below the minimum. We take the minimum daily temperature, and that number of degrees, we accumulate those over the time period of November through March, and they give us an index of just how cold the winter was. And we've got this is -5, this is -10, and this is -15. We're going to end up concentrating on -15, but we thought we would throw these in to see how well they correlate with yield over time, over the time period of 2003 to 2018. Again, you're seeing volatility, but not an upward trend. And then we looked at harvest rainfall, September through October, millimeters of rain, cumulative rain over those periods, with the idea that we talk in the paper about how that might induce a grower to pick early. It also affects the quality of the grape with that harvest rainfall. So we thought we'd look at that too. We did not, in this particular study, take a look at spring frost, but later on I'll show you a diagram of a spring frost. We figured that managing spring frost was pretty much under control by most growers. So we thought, let's just look at these other variables. And then, so here's the issue. Okay, so if we went to some insurer and said, we'd like to have a contract that paid out if, let's say, the number of degree days below -15 over the winter exceeded a certain level, and for every degree below that level, we want to get paid some money. This is a contract we want to enter into. We're willing to pay for this contract, kind of like insurance against cold winters. Now, what's happened is that there's been an increasing use of a new approach to modeling the relationship, let's say, of yields, in our case, tonnage, and a weather variable. So we have two variables, and what an insurance company is going to do if they're, they're sophisticated actuarially. They're probably going to use this copula function approach to design a simulation of a multivariate, bivariate distribution. And you can see here, just in terms of the studies that are increasingly using this, and these are, here's Topial for rating weather index insurance contracts. Here's another one as well. So this has been picking up speed. So that's the approach we're going to use. And it's based upon, I'm not going to go through this mathematics, it's based upon Sklar's theorem, 1959. This whole copula function analysis has a very interesting history in the financial industry because it was largely used to design those, when I talked about the 2008 financial crisis, the collateralized mortgage obligations, which aggregated mortgages into a security that could be sold. And the way they aggregated it was using this copula function approach, but they used the wrong approach, and that ended up making them look a lot less risky than they were. But we're going to use that same type of approach to examine the relationship between yields and these weather variables. And basically what it says is that the math says, well, if we're trying to figure out how these things relate in a nonlinear way, this is not just regression. This is capturing, subtleties of nonlinearity in it. It turns out that we can fit what's called a copula, a certain function, to the two variables, and that's separate from what we call their univariate distributions. We can identify those, but we can identify the copula separately, and then we can combine the two things together, and we get a much better sense of how, in our case, yields are going to relate to a weather variable. And then you try out these different copulas, and you pick the best one under certain criteria that you use. Yeah. So here's what these topial functions look like. It's a simulation of them. These are the 5 standard ones. There's some slightly more sophisticated ones, but these ones do a good trick of capturing any nonlinear relationship between two variables. Let's say. In this case, we've got two variables. There's a variable on the horizontal axis and the vertical axis, and this is just a simulation. If a Gaussian copula, a normal copula, fit the data, it would show you how they would vary over time. Student T copula. These Clayton and Gumbel copulas are interesting because they pick up what's called tail dependence. You can see that across the range of values, they're more highly correlated to two variables. They're more highly correlated at the tail. So this is called tail dependent. And the Gumbo picks it up on the high end. And then, of course, these can be flipped around, and you can see which one might pick up, for example, this upper tail dependence. I can flip this one around, and maybe it fits better. And the normal does capture some tail dependence. You can tell there's higher correlation here at the tails, but it's more symmetric, not based on one tail alone. And then the Frank, that tends, it's not very well shown here, but it tends to pick up, compared to the normal, more correlation in the middle of the values of the two variables. So it's pretty neat, and it gives a much better sense of, because when we just regress one variable on another, it assumes that the correlation between the two variables is the same over the range. It's the average. But that might not be the case. So we ran those. We ran the 5 copulas, and we looked for the best fitting ones. And we looked at vinifera yields, that yield data from 2003, 2018, detrended. So we're just looking at the effect of weather and hybrid yields, and then we looked at the total yield as well. We looked at what copula best fit the data to the weather variables that we were looking at. And what was interesting was that the Gaussian copula ended up being the best fitting copula in all cases. And we might have expected to see a bit more of the tail dependence that would have been picked up by the gumbo or the Clayton copula. But we think that what's happening there is because we've got aggregate yield across all producers belonging to the grape growers of Ontario. That aggregation is probably what might be disguising some tail dependence within for an individual producer's result. And we did, when we were undertaking the study, we did have an individual producer that we had their yield data, and we did see a little bit of that. But that's okay. We're saying here this association is going to aggregate the risk and try to look for a contract. And what we decided to do, of course, we can see with the Gaussian copula, this number underneath here is the Spearmint rank correlation coefficient. Tells you how well they're correlated. And without going into all of these, you can see that the highest correlation we had was with the winter injury variable, degree days minus 15 degrees Celsius. You know, how many degrees over those months in cumulative was it below minus 15? And that was very highly correlated with vinifera yields over 2003, 2018, 0.7395. Hybrid, yeah, not as much. Negative, of course, the negative correlation. The colder it is, the less the yield, you know, and that's what we're seeing. But of course, the hybrids have been designed to better, you know, handle cold weather. So we're going to look at vinifera yields. We're going to say, what if the Grape Growers Association said we want a weather derivatives, a parametric insurance contract that is going to hedge us against these degree days minus 15. So that's what we're going to do. So here's the data. 2003, 2018, here's the vinifera yield detrended. We've just flattened it so that it's up to 2018 essentially. And this is what yields would have looked like. We put a 2018 price, average price for vinifera was 1,345. So we put that on there. So here's the value that we're hedging. And then here's the degree days over those winters of number of aggregate degree days that were lower than minus 15. And you can see, and you might want to pay attention, one's above 20. There's one there, back 2003, 2005. You can see 2014, 15, you remember that was our extremely cold winters. So then, okay, so we've identified the copula, and then it's pretty simple from there. We say, what are the marginal distributions that best fit this data, both the vinifera yields and the degree days minus 5. And there we test about 135 different univariate distributions, find the best fitting ones, and that's all we've got there. And then from there, what this insurance company is going to do is they're going to say, okay, well, let's do a simulation, Monte Carlo simulation. We've got these univariate distributions. We have a Topial function that fits, and this is what it looks like. This is with 5,000, a simulation 5,000 times of degree days minus 15 and yield, vinifera yield along here. So now us as the producer is also, we're going to be saying, well, what is it that we want to hedge against? And that's very much a choice that is based upon risk aversion. You know, we can say we want a contract that will pay out so much forever, and at what point will it kick in, what strike? And so what we're going to do to simulate this, we said, look, you can see that for degree days minus 15 that were under 20, that's meaning that there were less than 20 cumulative degrees below -15 over the winter months. See that under there, the correlation between our vinifera yields in this simulation is not very high. But once we get above 20, you start seeing a linear trend in there. Negative, of course, because the yields go down with the colder it is. So to do the simulation, we said, well, let's say the grape growers say we want a contract that pays out over in any season over 20 degree days of -15. Okay, so it's going to pay out as the strike for here. And then how much do we want? Well, we're going to take this data here, and we're going to estimate what the loss is in value of yield per degree day along here. We're just going to do a regression analysis of that. And what that tells us is what's called the tick size. We're going to want a contract that's going to pay out if the winter injury index exceeds 20, and the tick size based on the regression is $156,000. So every degree day in that season, if it comes out above 20, we get 156,000 for each. Then what's the price of this contract is going to be? On the other side of the fence, the insurance firm is doing the same calculation. They're going to use what's called burn rate. They're going to say, well, what's our average payout on this based on simulations like this that we do? And we did that, and it comes out that that price of the contract they'd want is $400,000. $400,000, and so that's the premium. That's like your insurance cost. Across 400 in your average grower, 480 members of the Grape Growers of Ontario, that's about $837 per season. Now, that's going to be the cheapest because the insurance company is going to put on a bit of a premium on there that they just don't want the actuarial equal price. They're going to put, so it might be up, a bit higher. They might add a 30% on there, or even if it went up to about 1,000. That would be this price that's paid for the average grower. And then we look at what happens with that. Using the 2003-18 data, here's the unhedged value of the vinifera yield, detrended, so we were looking at this as if in any given year, this is what would have happened. This is what the price of the call option of the contract is. And here's when it would have paid out. Here just about nets out. Here another 200,000. You can see in 2014-15, $4 million would have paid out, 7 million in 2015, so that we have the hedged value of the total yield Grape Growers of Ontario. Here's just a diagram of the hedged versus the unhedged. The dashed line is the hedged value. You could see this thing would have really paid out, and every year if we were to enter into this type of contract, it reduces our total unhedged value a little bit, but pays off in a couple of years, and then this is just one contract. The more risk averse you are, you could have said, well, we want the strike price to be 15 degree days or 10 degree days. So it's going to pay out more often, right? Then we go back to the actual data here. You could have had it paying out in any one of these years. If it was 15, would have paid out in these years where, such as in 2018, would have paid, but you'd pay a higher price for the contract. This is how these weather contracts work. So they're meant to hedge not, disaster and peril, but rather sub conditions of weather. And what you have to know is how does it affect your your yields. Or you could look at quality too if you want to look at the price. So yeah, so we think it's an interesting simulation. Now that leaves you with the issue of the grape growers. Yeah, somebody's probably going to be willing to give you a contract for this as an association, but now you have to figure out how do you spread that out among your different members. And of course, the grape growers have members in along the Lake Erie shore and Prince Edward County. So interestingly enough, when you look at the weather conditions of the three areas in total, they're oftentimes not too far off, but you might distribute the costs and the benefits on an inverse relationship to geographic distance from the Vineland weather station. It's also been suggested in the study qualifying spatial basis risk that perhaps using altitude, latitude, longitude, as an index to just, those further away from the Vineland weathering station, whatever meteorological weather station you're using. You pay less, but you will receive less in terms of the amount that you'll get as well when it pays out. So that's the idea of it. And so this is a simulation that we thought would be of interest to look at from the perspective of an association, an aggregator of the risks. Some other things that you're seeing there in the literature now, is there a way of statistically combining those different weather industries that are important to viticulture in a way that will capture the risks into one index? And you see some work going on there that again uses Topial Functions to do that. They're using two variables, a weather index such as the Euclid or Winkler Index, which measures heat in the summer or growing conditions combined with dryness. They're combining with dryness, and you've seen some studies along those lines. What's going on in terms of this whole weather derivatives area? Well, blockchain, the basis of cryptocurrencies, is entering into financial contracts quite quickly. And one of the areas that it has the potential to disrupt in a good way, in the sense of lowering the cost of managing these types of contracts, is in weather derivatives. So you're seeing weather companies that are putting their weather data up on blockchains, so that smart contracts, so that would automatically pay out the minute that the weather index at the end of the season reached a certain point. So it reduces their costs of managing, of administrating. But it's been estimated about 30%. So this is coming along. Use of satellite data. A lot of these applications that were done in developing countries, you're increasingly seeing the use of satellite data as opposed to individual meteorological weather measuring sites. Here, for example, you can see 2 seasons of, this is a measure of dryness, and there's an index here that is normalized difference vegetation index. And just from the satellite, they can tell, based upon the translucency of the leaves in the vegetation, just how dry it is, and they can spot that down to individual places. So this is also coming into the area of weather derivatives. So an idea that seems good, seems to be some issues that keep it from being adopted extensively, but you can see some changes coming here. Before I finish up, I want to tell you about some other research that we're looking at as well. And this has to do with climate change. Very good paper done by Dr. Tony Shaw, who I've been a co-author with in past studies. He looked at the evolution of the Ontario cool climate wine regions in Canada. He looked at the three areas that are part of the Great Rivers of Ontario, and looked at several different weather variables as we've done. And he sees, does a test for, you can see some increasing trends in these bioclimatic indices that he took a look at. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been talking and warning about tipping points in terms of climate change. Tipping points where perhaps even within localized areas, you suddenly see a more dramatic change in weather. And when we were doing this study, we were examining our weather variables over quite a length of time. And we, in order to do the study, we picked the period of 2000 onward for a reason. So these things are called tipping points, that weather is very much a complex system, nonlinear, and it can be going along just fine, and then there can be some dramatic change called tipping points. They've been talking about this for a while. In terms of the global Earth, there are several different potential tipping points that they've identified. If the Greenland ice shield disintegrates, in Canada, permafrost loss, we know that's going to suddenly perhaps release a lot of CO2. Boreal forest shift in Canada, expansion north, contraction south. What's going to happen to climate change? And so you might have increasing, here's the CO2 emissions in Canada going up, fairly steadily. They've kind of flattened out over in recent years here. But here's weather, or this is temperature, and you can see, the sort of the trend line here. These red dots are when the temperature has been above an average from 1961 to 1990. So these are above average, below average of the time period, showing it's warming. But those big broad trends can take place, but underneath them can be some dramatic changes. And this relates to an area called chaos theory. It's very interesting when you look at nonlinear dynamics. A very simple example. It's a great book, Chaos Making New Science. It came out in 2008. It's had quite an impact in a lot of different fields. But take, for example, if I turn on the tap and I have water flowing from the tap and it's flowing rather smoothly. And then I start turning the tap and increasing the volume. And all of a sudden I get a lot of turbidity. And interesting enough, in engineering and fluid dynamics, that's a real difficult thing to predict. It's a non-linear impact. It's a tipping point. It's a tipping point that all of a sudden, due to perhaps the various elements of the tap, or whatever, and the water itself, there's a tipping point where all of a sudden we see this chaos system come about, high turbidity in the water. So there's these tipping points in a lot of aspects of nature. Well, when we were looking at the data, so this is, of course, carbon dioxide, as I said, going up and then temperature. But when we looked at our bioclimatic indices, we analyzed them using what's called intervention analysis. It's in technology in statistics. It's called time series analysis. And what we did there was use software that automatically looked for when there was a change. So here, for example, is winter injury, minus 15 degrees C. You can see that although if I was just to use a straight line and say, well, it used to be higher and now it's lower, so I can draw a straight line down there. But in actuality, when we analyze the time series in this more sophisticated way, we see that there was some sort of tipping point in around 1998 the level lowered, and the volatility in the, indicated by the span between these dotted lines, decreased from about 1998 on. It was a tipping point. There was some, it didn't just go down smoothly here. There was a tipping point. Of course, and these are outliers, time series outliers, identified in as well in the method. And that one, where we had the extremely cold winter in 2015, you can see it there, 14 and 15. But you can see there was an abrupt structural change in the data. Here's spring frost, okay, going along around 1984, structural shift down, and some change in volatility. Here we have the Winkler Index, 1998. Wow, all of a sudden, before that, 1965 on, like that, and we get some false outliers, and then all of a sudden, boom. It wasn't a monotonic increase over time. There was what appears to be tipping points. Same thing with the Euclid Index, around 98. Here's harvest rainfall, increased volatility after somewhere in the 90s. So there's the summary. Tipping point to winter injury, 1998. You see a lot around 1998, 95, 98. The spring frost, that was 85. But in this time period, we've obviously had some kind of tipping point within our idiosyncratic region. This is from the Vineland Research Station. So now we're talking about Niagara itself. Our microclimate that we exist in, perhaps the dynamics of that different as temperature increased, and we had increasing CO2, of course, giving rise to that. But we don't see a monotonic trend in these. There's an abrupt change, and it occurred around 1998. So we find that very interesting. We find it how this ties in quite a bit with this concept of tipping points and the nonlinear dynamics in weather. So that's something we've got under study right now that we're taking a look at. And of course, if I was designing weather contracts, I'm trying to price them, I want to know if there's a tipping point, because that's going to affect my simulation, etc. The other big question that arises out of this is there going to be another tipping point, and what will it look like? Even higher volatility, and it's not going to be. It might not be the case that we're just seeing this slow transition in the variables. The bioclimatic indices are important to winemaking. Could be very abrupt changes, as what appears to have taken place in around the mid to late 90s. And so that's the end of my presentation. So I'm open for any questions. I'll just say that, Dan, I see you're back on. I'm just going to give a little shout out for our next speakers as well. I think that's showing up, is it? Yeah. And so next Monday, February 7th, we've got Michael Whitmeister and Russell Johnston. They're doing Grapevine Public Memory, and we've got a series coming out all the way out throughout March and even into April. Quite eclectic in the topics. Debbie Inglis is well, that's Valentine's Day, February 14th. Debbie Inglis on Valentine's Day as well.
Thank you very much. You're making my job easy here. That's great. I really appreciate you putting that slide up. So we do have a couple of questions, and we'll try to keep this relatively brief and not keep people too long here. But so the first question is, who would be the sellers of these weather derivatives for the Ontario grape industry? So who is it who's actually paying these out?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting part. Down in the States, there are a number of different companies. They're smaller. The Weather Risk Management Association would be something I'd look to. The insurance companies might decide, okay, if this is a substantial enough contract, we could get into it. And they're all aware of this. It's just, is it a big enough market for us to enter into a contract? Obviously, Agricor is one that could potentially look at to be the seller of this contract as well.
And then somewhat related question here, given what you know about other sectors that are not making use of weather derivatives but could benefit from them, what's driving the hesitancy, and how would we overcome that for Ontario's grape and wine industry?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Of the studies that have been done around the general hesitancy in overall, is that as climate change has resulted in greater volatility and different sectors have experienced some substantial weather event, there has suddenly been a greater interest occurring with respect to weather contracts. So, you know, it died off for a while, the interest in it, but now, you know, the industry is saying we're starting to see some interest again that's coming about, and that's because of the greater volatility that we're seeing due to climate change.
Yeah, I think the volatility is something that everyone's starting to take notice of. Even if you weren't paying too much attention to it, it's hard to ignore now, right? So it certainly changes that conversation a lot. Well, listen, we really appreciate the time here, and thank you very much for the insight that you've given us. Really appreciate what you had to offer here, and for anyone who is watching, as Professor Cyr pointed out, this is the first in a series of 10 scheduled COVI lecture series events here for 2022. The next one is right around the corner, coming up next week. On Monday, February 7th, same time, 11:30 a.m. And as you pointed out, this is Professor of Geography Michael Rittmeister and Associate Professor of Communications, Communications, Pop Culture, and Film, Russell Johnson. And they're going to be presenting Grapes, Wine, and Public Memory, which also will be very interesting. And as you point out, this series has such a variety of topics and so many really interesting presenters and presentations that are available. So this and all the other lectures will be posted onto the COVI website very soon after they wrap up, after each week's presentation, so you can see them there and obviously share them. So with that, Professor Cyr, thank you very much for your time. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again next week. Thank you.